peace to all my the people in the house. So we're back, and we are back with you know, before 1913, before the Federal Reserve, before the takeover of the centralized banks came in. So, you know, for all those that want to know, before the 1913, the US banking system was not centralized. And that difference explains almost everything that came after. Now, historically and accurately, without any myths or labels, the US banking system before 1913, the real structure, there was no permanent central bank from 1836 to 1913. What existed instead was a patchwork system made of several layers. The national banking system of 1863 to 1913, this was the backbone created by National Bank Acts of 1863 and 1864. So you need to go look up the National Bank Acts of 1863 and 1864, how it worked. Banks were chartered by the federal government. To issue bank notes, banks had to buy U.S. government bonds, deposit those bonds with the Treasury. Bank notes were issued against those bonds. Money was asset backed, government bonds not created by a central bank. Limitations: inflexible currency supply, could not expand easily during panics, tied banking liquidity to federal debt. State and banks and trust companies alongside national banks. State chartered banks operated under state law. Trust companies held estates, managed corporate finance, acted as quasi banks, often less regulated than national banks. Trust companies grew massive by the early 1900s and were central players in panics. Three, correspondent banking, the real system. This is crucial. Banks were linked in tiers. Country banks held reserves at city banks. City banks held reserves at reserve city banks. Reserve city banks, New York, Chicago, and St. Louis. New York banks were de facto, New York banks were the de facto center. There was no central clearing authority. New York was the hub. New York was the hub of all banking, and it still is. Clearinghouse associations, private power centers. During crises, clearinghouses ran the system. They set settlement rules, issued clearinghouse certificates, emergency money, decided which banks survived, forced mergers or closures. These were private, unelected bodies. If you're looking for historical roots, my people, of your keepers, this is it. This is the ideal. The gold standard and specie settlement. Okay? The gold standard and specie settlement. Money was redeemable in gold or silver. Settlement in species between banks. Gold flows constrained. Credit expansion. So settled in species between banks. So if you have a bank and you're going to settle with another bank, they would call that settlement a specie, SPECIE. Gold flows constrained credit expansion. Gold shortages caused panics. Absence of a lender of last resort. This is the key weakness. No permanent lender of last resort. In panics, banks hoarded reserves. Aren't they hoarding the gold reserves now, buying it up, and the silver? In panics, banks hoarded reserves. Credit froze repeatedly. Major panic. 1873 was a major panic. 1893 was a major panic. 1907 was a major panic. The Panic of 1907 broke the system. J.P. Morgan and private coordination in 1907. In 1907, J.P. Morgan personally coordinated bank rescues. That was the meeting on Jekyll Island that J.P. Morgan coordinated. Private capital stabilized markets. Clearinghouses issued emergency currency. This terrified lawmakers. One man cannot be the lender of last resort. But J.P. Morgan became a lender in Jekyll Island. Why the Federal Reserve was created. Historical, my people, not the propaganda. The Fed was designed to centralize reserves, act as a lender of last resort, elasticize currency, replace private clearinghouse control, reduce dependency on private financiers. Whether it succeeded or overreached is a separate debate, but the problem it addressed was real. Now, there's a sentence summary that they say that we can use. So, before 1913, U.S. Banking operated through a decentralized network of national and state banks linked by correspondent relationships and private clearing houses with gold-based settlement and no permanent central lender of last resort. That's historical, airtight. Just that, what I just recited to you. Why this matters for your larger question. You're not wrong to sense that. My people, the power shifted. Custodians replaced markets. Administration replaced negotiation. So now the trustees are administering your estates instead of you negotiating. Custodians, which were the banks, replaced the markets. But before 1913, power didn't disappear. It was just private and chaotic, not centralized and stable. Now, compare pre-1913 versus post-1913 power structures. You can show what was lost and what was gained. We can explain which parts of the old system still exist quietly. We can tie it back to trust law and custody without fantasy. Now, my people, when we talk about the pre-1913 versus, okay, The post 1913, what we're going to come up with, my people, you would be amazed. So basically, the power structures, the center of power pre 1913, no permanent central authority, power concentrated in New York, correspondent banks, private clearinghouses, all in New York, large trust companies, all in New York. Crisis control was ad hoc and private. Now, during the post 1913, permanent institutional center Federal Reserve System, power embedded in reserve banks, Federal Reserve Board, crisis control is formal and continuous. Shift, private coordination to institutionalized authority. Who controlled liquidity? Pre 1913, liquidity controlled by gold flows, clearinghouse committees, private financiers. Currency supply was rigid. Post 1913, liquidity controlled by centralized reserves, discount window, open market operations. So, where's the discount window? Currency supply became elastic. The shift was a physical constraint administrative decision. Who acted in crisis in pre 1913? Clearinghouses suspended convertibility, issued emergency certificates, JP Morgan styled private rescues. Post 1913, Federal Reserve acts as lender of last resort, coordinated nationwide response, backstopped by the Treasury. The shift, personal authority to bureaucratic authority. Accountability and visibility. Pre 1913, decisions made by bankers, clearinghouse committees, very little public oversight, high transparency among insiders. Post 1913, decisions made by boards, committees, technocrats, limited public oversight, reduced insider visibility. Shift, elite transparency, procedural opacity. So, my people, the role of Congress, pre 1913, Congress chartered banks, set reserve requirements, did not manage day-to-day banking. Post 1913, Congress delegates authority, conducts oversight hearings, operational control sits elsewhere. So the shift, direct rulemaking, went to delegated governance. Trust and custody. Pre 1913, trust companies held estates, corporate assets, private wealth, trust law powerful but fragmented. Post 1913, custody embedded into reserve banks, treasury, federal agencies. True logic becomes systematic. Shift, private trust to institutional custody. So, people, this is a lot of what has gone on from now, from before to now. So the big power transformation before 1913, power lived in relationships. Power lived in the control required negotiation. Power came from stability depended on private coordination. Power came from failure was visible and personal. After 1913, power lives in institutions, control exercised through rules and custody, stability enforced administratively, failure is abstracted and deferred. This is why it feels like keepers replace participants. So, what you can actually use, my people, the creation of the Federal Reserve marked a shift from a decentralized relationship driven banking order governed by private clearinghouses and correspondent networks to a centralized custodial system in which liquidity, settlement, and crisis response were administered by permanent institutions insulated from direct public control. So, that's a strong, defensible paragraph that you can use. So, why people argue about this today? Well, pre 13 was unstable but plural. Post 13 is stable but insulated. One favored freedom with chaos, the other favors order with distance. Neither is morally pure. They optimize for different risk. So you would have to start studying modern power post 2008. Then you would go over and study pre 1913 elements. You would also study custody of people and custody of money. So, you know, the bottom line here, my people, is that the bankers of today know way more than the bankers before. Because the bankers of today are the guilders. So some of the guilders broke off and wanted to start to usurp the people. So it's up to you, my people, what you're going to do. Nobody can really help you. We can only give you guidance, but the rest of the work has to be done on your own, because you're the only one that can sign the paperwork, represent the paperwork, and the paperwork is not ours, it's your paperwork. So you have to be able to stand on your own paperwork. You have to be able to stand in the public. You have to be able to stand in the private. Sometimes you're going to have to be neutral. Sometimes you're going to have to be aggressive. But you're going to have to defend your standpoint, where you stand. You're going to have to be the trustee. You're going to have to be the executor. You're going to have to be the custodian. You're going to have to be the conservator. You're going to have to be the guardian. You have to be all 5 titles. You have to have a ledger. Okay, you have to know how to keep your books. So, we're about to get up on out of here, my people, because I done dropped you a good game. A good game. So, you need to learn your own game. If you need consultations, 407-300-5377. This is the United States Private Enterprise Free State. In on the check on with another public announcement. 407-300-5377.